The boundary between pseudoscience and the frontier of theoretical physics has always been porous. Yet we treat the concept of extrasensory perception as a relic of Cold War paranoia or parlor tricks. But if we suspend our reflexive skepticism and assume for a moment that the historical archives of projects like Stargate or the secretive Soviet psychotronics programs weren't just exercises in misinformation, we are forced to confront terrifyingly complex biological reality. To explain the psychic is not to invoke magic, but to demand a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the fabric of space-time. If a human mind can truly perceive a remote location or anticipate a future event, we aren't looking at a gift. We are looking at a biological antenna tuned to a frequency of the universe that the rest of us have evolved to ignore for the sake of survival. We must ask, what kind of neurological architecture would be required to facilitate the collapse of a wave function across a distance of thousands of miles? If these experiments were true, the first pillar of our explanation must be quantum entanglement scaled to a macroscopic level. In the standard model, the brain is a chemical computer, but in a world where psychics exist, the brain becomes a quantum system. We would have to posit that the microtubule structures within our neurons, as suggested by the Ork-Or theory, are capable of maintaining quantum coherence at room temperature, allowing the brain to bypass the locality of classical physics. This means that remote viewing isn't the eyes seeing across a distance. It is the mind accessing a non-local data set already present in the vacuum state. The universe, at its most fundamental level, would be a holographic information field, where every point contains the data of the whole. A psychic would simply be an individual with a rare genetic mutation or a neuroplastic anomaly in the parietal lobe that allows them to filter this noise into a coherent signal. We are talking about a radical shift from the brain as a generator of consciousness to the brain as a transducer of a universal field. Furthermore, the implications for our understanding of time are devastating. If precognition were a validated laboratory result, the linear progression of entropy, the arrow of time we rely on, becomes a convenient illusion. We would have to look toward the transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics, where waves travel both forward and backward in time. A psychic premonition would be the brain's sensitivity to advanced waves returning from the future. Imagine the metabolic cost of such a process. The oxidative stress on a brain trying to process non-linear causality would be immense. We wouldn't be looking at calm mystics, but at individuals whose biology is under constant siege by a sensory overload that defies the four-dimensional constraints of our evolution. The experiments wouldn't just be about testing if they could see through walls. They would be about trying to figure out how a biological organism can survive the shattering of the causal chain without descending into total neural entropy. The boundary between pseudoscience and the frontier of theoretical physics has always been porous. Yet, we treat the concept of extrasensory perception as a relic of Cold War paranoia or parlor tricks. But if we suspend our reflexive skepticism and assume, for a moment, that the historical archives of projects like Stargate or the secretive Soviet psychotronics programs weren't just exercises in misinformation, we are forced to confront a terrifyingly complex biological reality. To explain the psychic is not to invoke magic, but to demand a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the fabric of space-time. If a human mind can truly perceive a remote location or anticipate a future event, we aren't looking at a gift. We are looking at a biological antenna tuned to a frequency of the universe that the rest of us have evolved to ignore for the sake of survival. We must ask, what kind of neurological architecture would be required to facilitate the collapse of a wave function across a distance of thousands of miles? If these experiments were true, the first pillar of our explanation must be quantum entanglement scaled to a macroscopic level. In the standard model, the brain is a chemical computer. But in a world where psychics exist, the brain becomes a quantum system. We would have to posit that the microtubule structures within our neurons, as suggested by the Ork-Or theory, are capable of maintaining quantum coherence at room temperature, allowing the brain to bypass the locality of classical physics. This means that remote viewing isn't the eyes seeing across a distance. It is the mind accessing a non-local data set already present in the vacuum state. The universe, at its most fundamental level, would be a holographic information field where every point contains the data of the whole. A psychic would simply be an individual with a rare genetic mutation or a neuroplastic anomaly in the parietal lobe that allows them to filter this noise into a coherent signal. We are talking about a radical shift from the brain as a generator of consciousness to the brain as a transducer of a universal field. Furthermore, the implications for our understanding of time are devastating. If precognition were a validated laboratory result, the linear progression of entropy, the arrow of time we rely on, becomes a convenient illusion. We would have to look toward the transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics, where waves travel both forward and backward in time. A psychic premonition would be the brain's sensitivity to advanced waves returning from the future. Imagine the metabolic cost of such a process. The oxidative stress on a brain trying to process nonlinear causality would be immense. We wouldn't be looking at calm mystics, but at individuals whose biology is under constant siege by a sensory overload that defies the four-dimensional constraints of our evolution. The experiments wouldn't just be about testing if they could see through walls. They would be about trying to figure out how a biological organism can survive the shattering of the causal chain without descending into total neural entropy. If we move deeper into the biological scaffolding of this hypothesis, we must address the signal-to-noise ratio of the human consciousness. In a reality where psychic phenomena are genuine, the brain's primary function would not be to perceive the world, but to act as a colossal inhibitory filter, a reducing valve, as Aldous Huxley once theorized. If the universe is indeed a non-local information field, then the psychic is not someone who has gained a new sense, but someone who has lost a specific type of evolutionary blindness. This brings us to the neurobiology of the thalamus and the reticular activating system. In a standard human, these structures act as a firewall, discarding 99% of external data to prevent the conscious mind from being incinerated by the sheer volume of cosmic background information. The experimental psychic would be a subject whose neural gating mechanisms are fundamentally leaky. This would suggest that the secret government programs were likely not looking for a spirit, but for a specific neurochemical signature, perhaps a hypersensitivity in the pineal gland, or a unique configuration of the neurotransmitter dimethyltryptamine acting as a bridge between the physical and the multidimensional. When we look at the data from the infamous Gansfeld experiments, or the SRI international studies, the common thread is the quieting of the classical senses. This points toward a phenomenon known as stochastic resonance. In physics, this is where a signal that is too weak to be detected can be boosted by adding white noise to the system. If psychic ability is real, it exists at a sub-Planckian energy level, far below the threshold of our standard five senses. The experiments, therefore, would be designed to put the brain into a state of near-zero sensory input, forcing the consciousness to reach for the only remaining data source, the quantum fluctuations of the zero-point field. We are talking about a bioreceiver, capable of picking up the ghost signals of distant matter. Scientifically, this would require the brain to utilize some form of, quote, dark matter interaction, or perhaps a sensitivity to longitudinal scalar waves, waves that do not lose energy over distance and pass through lead shielding as if it were air. If the mind can interface with these waves, then distance, as we understand it in Euclidean geometry, simply ceases to exist. This leads us to the most unsettling part of the scientific inquiry, the observer effect. In quantum mechanics, the act of measurement collapses the wave function. If a psychic is viewing a secret facility, are they merely observing it, or are they subtly altering the physical state of that location simply by perceiving it? This blurs the line between ESP and psychokinesis. If the mind can extract information from a distance, it is because the mind is fundamentally tangled with that distance. There is no such thing as a passive observer in a quantum universe. If those Cold War experiments were successful, it would mean that the human mind is a participatory force in the construction of reality. The researchers wouldn't just be measuring a person's ability to see a hidden photograph. They would be discovering that human intention is a fundamental force of nature, perhaps as real and measurable as electromagnetism or gravity. The weaponization of such a gift wouldn't just be about spying. It would be about the ability to collapse specific probabilities, to literally think a specific outcome into existence by collapsing the wave function of a future event. Expanding from the individual to the collective, we must grapple with the terrifying possibility that if psychic phenomena are biologically grounded, they cannot be contained within a single skull. If the brain is indeed a transducer of non-local information, then we are not isolated islands of awareness, but nodes in a massive subterranean network of consciousness, a noosphere that has remained invisible to us only because we lack the instrumentation to measure it. Scientific validation of psychic experiments would imply the existence of a global consciousness field, similar to the electromagnetic field of the Earth itself. This would mean that every thought, every trauma, and every significant shift in human emotion ripples through a shared medium. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, PEAR, lab hinted at this when they discovered that random event generators across the globe began to show signs of order during major world events. If psychics were real, it would mean that certain individuals are capable of surfing these ripples, tapping into a collective reservoir of data that contains the sum total of human experience. We would have to redefine the concept of the ego as a mere biological firewall designed to keep us from drowning in the psychic noise of 8 billion other minds. In this framework, the experiments take on a much darker, more systemic tone. If you can prove that a mind can influence a machine or sense a distant thought, you have proven that humanity is a singular, interconnected organism. This leads us to the hypothesis of morphic resonance, proposed by Rupert Sheldrake. If these psychic abilities were being tested, the goal might not have been to find a super soldier, but to understand the morphic field that governs the behavior of entire species. This would suggest that once a certain number of individuals learn a skill or perceive a truth, that information becomes easier for the rest of the species to access through a form of biological cloud sync. The scientific explanation for this would rely on, quote, quantum biology at an ecological scale. We would be looking for entanglement clusters in the atmosphere, or perhaps a hidden property of the Earth's ionosphere, the cavity of the Schumann resonance, acting as a massive low-frequency storage drive for human neural output. If the experiments were true, then our secret services weren't just looking for spies. They were looking for the admin password to the collective human psyche. The most radical scientific explanation for how this information is actually stored and retrieved involves the concept of information theory applied to the fabric of space itself. Physicists like John Wheeler suggested that the universe is it from bit, that matter and energy are just expressions of underlying information. If a psychic can know the contents of a sealed envelope in a bunker across the ocean, it is because they are accessing the source code of the universe before it is rendered into physical reality. This would mean that consciousness is more fundamental than matter. This top-down causality would shatter our current understanding of biology. Instead of the brain creating the mind would be a localized user interface for a cosmic database. The experiments, then, were likely an attempt to hack the interface. This brings us to the simulation hypothesis through a scientific backdoor. If a psychic can manipulate reality or foresee its paths, they are essentially interacting with the software of the universe rather than its hardware. We are talking about the ability to perceive the wireframes of our physical world. The psychological cost of such a realization would be cataclysmic. To see the world not as solid objects, but as a flickering stream of probabilistic data, would lead to a total detachment from the human condition. The subjects of these experiments wouldn't be heroes. They would be the first victims of a new, hyper-reality that the human nervous system was never designed to endure. To venture further into this rabbit hole, we must consider the possibility that the psychic is not actually peering across space, but rather up the dimensional ladder. If our universe is a three-dimensional brain floating in a higher dimensional bulk, as suggested by M-theory, then the constraints of distance and solid matter are merely artifacts of our limited perspective. In this scientific framework, a psychic event would be the biological equivalent of a shortcut through the fourth or fifth dimension. While we see 2 points as being separated by thousands of miles of geography, a mind capable of hyperdimensional perception would see them as being nearly touching in the higher dimensional manifold. This is the folded paper analogy of space-time, but applied to human neurobiology. If the experiments conducted in the mid-20th century were based on this truth, then researchers were essentially trying to overclock the human brain to perceive the z-axis of reality. This would require a radical restructuring of the visual cortex, moving away from processing photons bouncing off surfaces toward processing the curvature of space-time itself. We are talking about a geometric consciousness that perceives the world not as objects, but as a series of interconnected hypershapes, where past, present, and future are simply different coordinates on a static map. But if this is true, we run into the grandfather paradox of information. If a psychic can perceive a future event and then act to change it, where does the original information come from? This brings us to the block universe theory, where every moment that has ever happened or will ever happen exists simultaneously in a frozen four-dimensional block. In this model, the psychic isn't predicting anything. They are simply viewing a different part of the block. However, the introduction of human agency creates a temporal feedback loop. Scientifically, if these experiments were real, we would have to observe retrocausality, where the effect precedes the cause. This has already been observed at the subatomic level in delayed choice quantum eraser experiments. If we scale this up to human consciousness, it suggests that our current thoughts are being subtly pulled by our future experiences. The psychic would be someone with a high temporal conductivity, meaning their present moment neural state is highly influenced by their future neural state. This isn't just a superpower, it's a structural breakdown of the laws of thermodynamics. It suggests that information can leak out of the future and into the past, creating a closed, time-like curve within the human brain. The scientific horror of this realization is that it implies a total lack of free will, or at least a version of it we haven't yet mastered. If the experiments were true, and the future can be seen, then the future is already written in the source code of the vacuum. The secret programs wouldn't just be testing for vision, they would be testing the elasticity of fate. They would be trying to see if, by knowing the future, we can generate enough quantum interference to knock the universe onto a different track. This leads to the many worlds interpretation. A psychic would be someone whose consciousness can tunnel between parallel timelines, picking up data from a version of reality that is slightly offset from our own. When a psychic is wrong in a laboratory setting, it might not be a failure of their ability, but a crosstalk between two nearly identical branches of the multiverse. They are seeing a truth, just not our truth. If the military-industrial complex realized this, the goal would have shifted from remote viewing to reality shifting, using the human mind as a gravitational anchor to pull our entire timeline toward a more favorable outcome. We are no longer talking about biology. We are talking about ontological warfare, where the battlefield is the very definition of what is real. If we push this logic to its absolute precipice, we must confront the most unsettling scientific possibility of all, that the psychic channel is not an empty vacuum of information, but a populated ecosystem. If consciousness is a fundamental field, like electromagnetism, then it is statistically improbable that human beings are the only entities inhabiting it. In the context of deep state experiments, the shift from sensing a target to communicating with an intelligence is the ultimate hidden transition. Scientifically, this would be explained through the lens of plasma intelligence, or non-biological life forms. If the vacuum of space is a superfluid of information, then thoughts could manifest as stable, self-organizing structures, what Carl Jung called archetypes, but what a physicist might call solitons in the field of consciousness. These experiments wouldn't have been just about looking at distant cities. They would have been attempts to dial a phone into a layer of reality where information is sentient. We would be looking at the brain not as a computer, but as a trans-dimensional modem, attempting to handshake with entities that do not have a physical carbon-based body, but exist as coherent patterns of frequency within the dark matter that makes up 85% of our universe. This leads us to the interdimensional hypothesis for psychic phenomena. If a psychic subject in a laboratory describes a spirit guide or a presence that provides information, a rigorous scientific framework would identify this as an encounter with a shadow biosphere. This is the idea that right next to us, occupying the same space but vibrating in a different phase, is an entire ecology of beings. Usually, our sensory hardware decoheres from them to avoid confusion. But in the heightened, pressurized state of a psychic experiment, the subject's brain might undergo a phase lock with this shadow reality. The information retrieved wouldn't be coming from the subject's own mind, but would be downloaded from a non-human intelligence that views our 3D world from a top-down perspective. This would explain why psychic data is often cryptic, symbolic, or non-linear. It is being translated from a higher dimensional language that doesn't use words, but gestalts of pure meaning. The experiment then becomes a form of exodiplomacy, where the human mind is used as a bridge to negotiate with forces that have been here since the Big Bang, observing us from the folded dimensions of the Calabi-Yau manifold. Finally, we must consider the anthropogenic field, or the idea that we are literally coding our own reality through collective belief. In physics, the quantum Zeno effect shows that the frequent observation of a system can freeze its state. If a government spends decades and billions of dollars obsessing over psychic potential, they might actually be creating the phenomenon through the sheer pressure of expectation. This is the concept of a tulpa, or a thought form, validated by physics. If enough minds, especially those in positions of power, believe in the psychic, the quantum probability of that phenomenon occurring increases. We are talking about ontological engineering, where the boundary between subjective imagination and objective reality is dissolved by the power of concentrated intent. If the experiments were true, it means we have discovered that the universe is not a machine made of parts, but a great thought that we are co-authoring. The terrifying realization for the scientists in those labs wouldn't be that they found a spy. It would be the realization that they are living in a plastic universe, where the laws of physics are not fixed, but are merely the consensus habits of the collective mind. To change the world, you wouldn't need a bomb or a rocket. You would only need to change the frequency of the dominant narrative, because in a psychic reality, truth is whatever the most coherent observer perceives it to be. The final convergence of this scientific inquiry leads us to a destination that is as much a nightmare as it is a liberation: the total dissolution of the self and the end of the mental privacy era. If the experiments were true, and the mind is truly a non-local entity, then the concept of a secret becomes a physical impossibility. We are entering the territory of neuro-totalitarianism, where the walls of our skulls, previously the only impenetrable fortresses in human history, are revealed to be porous membranes. Scientifically, this would be the global brain transition, an evolutionary leap where humanity moves from being a collection of disparate individuals to a Type 1 civilization on the Kardashev scale. Not because of our energy consumption, but because of our information integration. In this final stage, the psychic is no longer an anomaly. They are the alpha testers for a new species. We are talking about the omega point of Teilhard de Chardin, seen through the cold lens of quantum informatics. The scientific explanation for our current lack of these abilities would be that we are in a larval stage, and the secret experiments were merely the first, clumsy attempts to force the metamorphosis of the human nervous system into its next state of being. But as we conclude this exploration, we must face the Fermi paradox of the mind. If these powers are real and latent within us, why haven't they dominated our history? The answer likely lies in the biological stability argument. A species that can perceive all possible futures and hear every distant scream would succumb to a consensus collapse within a single generation. Evolution has suppressed the psychic function because it is a Darwinian dead end for a physical predator. You cannot hunt or protect a tribe if you are constantly experiencing the oneness of the universe or the pain of your prey. Therefore, if the experiments were true, they were essentially anti-evolutionary. The researchers were trying to reverse millions of years of specialized neural filtering. This suggests that the secret psychic programs didn't end because they failed. They ended because they succeeded too well. They found that a trans-dimensional human is no longer a human in any sense that a government can control, tax, or use for war. A mind that is truly seen through the veil of space-time is a mind that can no longer be motivated by the petty tribalism of a three-dimensional planet. The silence from the archives isn't the silence of a debunked myth. It is the silence of a containment breach. Ultimately, the scientific explanation for psychic phenomena is that we are living in a participatory universe that is still under construction. We are not just observers of the laws of physics. We are the parameters that define them. If the experiments over the last century were genuine, then we have already crossed the event horizon. We have proven that the soul is not a ghost in the machine, but the field that allows the machine to exist in the first place. This realization forces us to look at the stars not as distant points of light, but as local nodes in a conscious network we are only just beginning to map. The psychic experiment was the first time our species tried to look into the mirror of the vacuum and blink. What we saw staring back wasn't a superpower, but a terrifying responsibility. The knowledge that every thought we think ripples to the edge of the cosmos and back. We are the architects of a reality that is far more fragile and far more interconnected than our classical science ever dared to admit. The curtain has been pulled back, and we are left with the chilling, beautiful truth. The universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is as strange as we are capable of imagining. And in that capability lies the power to reshape existence itself.